Good morning, good evening, or afternoon, anyone wherever you are. I hope you're all well, healthy, and hanging in there in these strange times. But let's crack on with today's fantastic webinar. You will notice that I am not Sergio Laraberthial this week. I'm Gary Hodgson, Project Officer for iCoachKids, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's live webinar. This is already our 14th live event this year, which is excellent. And thank you for making the time to join us. Today, we're going to explore transformational leadership in youth sport with two world leaders in this area. So we have both Dr. Jean Cote and Dr. Jennifer Turnage, and they both work in Canada for Queen's University, and we're super excited to have them on the webinar. But before we get going, just going to go through some of the kind of family rules. So as I alluded to earlier, if you can, please keep your camera and your microphone off. While the webinar is ongoing, please submit your questions using the chat function, whether you are on YouTube or in the comment section, on Zoom, or the comment section if you are live on YouTube. And please be respectful to all. We're all here to share and learn. In the meantime, after this webinar, why not subscribe to our YouTube channel or sign up to one of our 3 e-learning courses, or head to the iCoachKids website. Just give us a follow, a like, and a subscribe. So I'm going to introduce our presenters today. So we have Jean Cote, who is a world-renowned researcher in sport coaching. His research interests focus on the developmental and psychosocial factors that affect sport and physical activity performance and participation. He's also interested in the complex interaction of children, parents, and coaches in the development of talent and in the achievement of personal excellence. We also have today Dr. Jennifer Turnage, who did her doctoral degree in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University under the supervision of our other guest. In addition to her doctoral work, she also completed her undergraduate in 2009 and master's in 2011 at Queen's. And broadly, her research explores how coach, athlete, and peer relationships can promote positive development in youth sport. Specifically, she examines how coaches' leadership behaviours can influence the quality of youth sport experiences. Welcome, Jean and Jennifer.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pass over to our presenters now to present a short piece. As I've said, please put your comments in the chat box or on comments on YouTube, and we'll address that shortly. Over to you guys.
All right. I will share my screen. So thanks Gary for having us, and thanks to Sergio, who cannot be here this morning, but we appreciate being on this and being able to share some of our work. So I will share my screen, and we will start with a very quick presentation of this work. And mainly what we would like to do in this short presentation is really try to show where the work is coming from. Sometimes we looked at a piece of evidence or a piece of work and we don't really understand the background work that has led to transformational leadership in youth sport and transformational coaching. So I'm going to share my screen now and start with a few slides. Everybody sees this? All good? Yes?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, perfect. So, so you gave an introduction, but really this work on transformational leadership is Jennifer's work and her PhD and postdoc at Queen's that really have initiated this and have really made this work available to coaches for consumption and for help for the work with different organizations and sport organizations. So what I'd like to do here is just start with a couple of slides, and then Jen will take over and explain a little bit the background of how transformational leadership became kind of this idea of transformational coaching. But really where I would like to start is with maybe kind of 10 to 15 years of work that we've done on looking at observing coaches and observing the interactions between coaches and athletes in youth sport. And really what this work has implied is that we've been looking at going to the field, the arena, the gymnasium with cameras and put a microphone on the coach and have a big parabolic microphone to get the interactions between coaches and athletes, and really recording games and practices and trying to understand what's going on during games and practices in terms of interactions. And some of the things that came out of this is that professional knowledge and behaviors of coaches is the foundation, and it's an important, very important aspect of coaching, but is insufficient for optimal personal development through sport. And really what came out of these studies, of these observational studies, and a lot of these studies were done over a season, so kind of semi-longitudinal in terms of time frame. But what we found is that the interpersonal and intrapersonal knowledge and behaviors of coaching were the additional ingredients that really differentiate between a very effective coach and a less effective coach. So basically what we found is that it's not really what coaches do, the content of what they do in terms of how they design a drill or how they design a practice, but it's more about the how. It's about the communication and how they interact with their athletes in coaching. And one of the study here, I think that kind of really showed this is, you know, like we would observe coaches and we would look at the best, like a group of the very effective one and the less effective one. And really it's the interaction in terms of how coaches talk to their athletes during a practice that makes the difference between a highly effective and a less effective coach. And based on this, and this is where Jen really came in terms of her doctorate work, is we try to say, okay, so well, if it's the communication, the interpersonal aspect of coaching, that is a very important aspect. And we found that that has not been really conceptualized in the coaching research. And where we went, you know, we could have found other models, but we looked at leadership as a way of conceptualizing interpersonal behaviors in coaching. And I think some of the best work that we found is the full range leadership model. And, you know, you can look at coaching or you can look at leadership as leader being at one end of the continuum, being really engaged with their athletes and also being effective or ineffective. So we're engaged or not engaged to effective or ineffective. And if you look at coaches or leaders that are engaged and ineffective, the research, we could describe this style as a toxic kind of leadership, toxic style of leadership. And then if you go to the other end where coaches or leaders are not engaged and ineffective, that's the laissez-faire leadership style. So where coaches that show no really interest in, and you know, they will check their Facebook or they will check their email during a practice. And then in all these studies, one style that we found that was very used by a lot of coaches is this neutral type of leadership, where it's right in the middle, where we don't really know if it's very effective or it's not the most effective style. It could be ineffective. Coaches are engaged or not, but coaches are basically giving instruction without any kind of emotion, without any kind of they're not very enthusiastic in how they present the information. So you go here, you do that, and so basically just organizing the setting without much emotion and enthusiasm in doing that. Then there's this transactional style of leadership that I think people are familiar with where leaders use a lot of rewards and punishment. And I think that's done quite a bit in coaching. And as you can see it here, is just sitting on this idea of this being effective or less effective. So the issues with transactional leadership is that in the long term, it will have a very negative influence on motivation. And then finally, there's the idea of transformational leadership, where coaches are engaged, leaders are engaged, and has been shown through the literature in many fields of study, military, education, medicine, sport, that it's a very effective style to influence athletes' engagement and to influence athletes' development in sport and follower development in sport. So this is, again, I just wanted to present those two slides to really situate the whole idea of transformational leadership in coaching as a way to understand interpersonal behaviors. And I think with the previous slide, I demonstrated that interpersonal behaviors is a key factor in coaching that has not really been conceptualized before this work. So I'll leave it to Jen here to take over and describe a little bit more transformational leadership.
All right, thank you, Jean. So as Jean highlighted in that model, we're really trying to understand what effective interpersonal behaviors might look like. So we were really drawing upon this idea of transformational leadership, and really transformational leadership is focused on follower development. So in the case of sport, we're really focusing on athlete development, which we've conceptualized using the 4 C's. So competence, confidence, connection, and character. So really the idea of transformation is really focusing on the athletes, and that they are the ones who are transforming, and they are the ones who are acquiring and developing these outcomes. So we really found a lot of overlap between the idea of transformational leadership and a lot of the work that we had been doing in positive youth development, and that it was taking a strength-based approach to really building on followers' skills and attitudes so that they could develop these positive outcomes. And really drawing again from organizational psych, that it is designed to empower, inspire, and challenge their followers so that they can achieve these long-term outcomes. So let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about transformational leadership, you'll often hear the components of transformational leadership, which are conceptualized as the 4 I's. Oh,
sorry.
So the 4 I's, just very briefly, and we can certainly elaborate on these later on in the webinar, but the first one is idealized influence. So really this idea of practicing what you preach. And this is really how leaders gain trust and respect by acting as a positive role model and demonstrating their personally held beliefs. So it really is tied to the values of the coach and how they actually demonstrate those values through their behaviors. And again, really focusing on how we develop trust and respect with our athletes. The second component is inspirational motivation. So this is all about believing in your athletes. So again, this is really focused on empowering and challenging your followers in terms of thinking about what that vision we're actually going to have and how we can actually communicate that belief in our athletes so they can achieve higher level goals. As far as intellectual stimulation, this really is about involving our athletes in the coaching process. So providing opportunities for them to get involved, to think about problems in new ways, to adopt new perspectives, and really challenge that sort of critical thinking aspect of their development. And lastly, we have individualized consideration, which really involves a more person-centered approach in which you're showing genuine care and concern, not just for the athlete, but really the athlete as a person. So considering their development both in and out of sport. So these 4 I's really come from the organizational psych literature. And this is traditionally how transformational leadership has been measured. So people will use questionnaires to assess their leaders on these 4 I's. But we still had a few questions in terms of what do these 4 I's actually look like in sport? So that really was a focus of my doctorate, was trying to get a better sense of what does transformational coaching actually look like. So as I mentioned, the vast majority of studies really had been using questionnaires. So because of our background in using observation, we really had an interest in finding a new way of measuring and capturing these behaviors and really understanding what do they look like in a sport context. So to do this, we did a series of literature reviews. So trying to understand both how transformational leadership has been measured in other contexts, but also looking at the coaching literature and seeing how we've been measuring coaching behaviors and finding ways of bringing those bodies of literature together. We also did a lot of observations. So we used a library of videos that we had had over the years and watched a lot of videos of coaches in various contexts. So both high performance, youth sport, male and female, individual and team sport, able-bodied and parasport context to really understand what are those behaviors that we're seeing so that we could actually map those back to the literature and understand how these behaviors that we're seeing in real time link to these ideas of transformational leadership. And also that we did interviews. So trying to better understand how and why transformational coaching behaviors are used. So we did interviews with coaches, both to understand, behaviors that they actually use that align with these ideas. But also we had a series of studies where we actually had clips of coaches using different types of leadership behaviors and talk them through to better understand their decision-making and their thought process behind why they use these behaviors and the outcomes they're actually trying to achieve. So all this led, sorry, in the next slide, to we really focused on developing a coding system, so an observational instrument that would let us actually measure these behaviors in real time. And this is where these 11 behaviors of what we'll call transformational coaching really came from. So it came from that series of studies to understand what those 4 I's, what does it mean in sport? And this is how we conceptualize transformational coaching. So if we're mapping it back to them, again, you can see how these behaviors align with the idea of the 4 I's. Some interesting behaviors that emerged from this. One I think that was always, I found interesting was the idea of showing vulnerability and humility and how that relates to gaining trust and respect from your athletes. So that can be, admitting gaps in knowledge or sharing your experiences with your athletes. We also saw a lot of really great behaviors in terms of how to provide meaning and challenge to your athletes' tasks and roles, giving opportunities for athletes to have input and decision-making and leadership. And it was really that person-centered approach about actually showing interest in your athletes and recognizing their contributions. So this really is how we conceptualized these behaviors, and that we were actually able to use this tool to measure behaviors in real time. And so this is really just, again, highlighting that the broader observation instrument, because while we were really interested in transformational coaching, we also recognize that coaches aren't transformational 100% of the time. So in our observational instrument, we also develop categories to help us capture the other aspects of the full range leadership model. So again, this is really providing a more holistic picture of what leadership behaviors look like in real time, because again, we found that most coaches tend to have a balance between these different behaviors. So a lot of coaches will have a profile that includes a mix of transformational, transactional, and neutral behaviors. But we also see coaches who also exhibit the full range and might have transformational and toxic behaviors. So understanding how coaches actually balance these behaviors and when they use them and which athletes they use them with is a really important question that we're trying to answer. So, and the next slide, the other piece that we recognized was that coaches are not 100% transformational, but we also found some gaps. So when we were observing coaches, we had a study of ice hockey coaches, and we recognized that there was some gaps in their behavior where they were displaying a lot of neutral behaviors, and that we had an opportunity to both improve the quantity and quality of coaches' leadership behaviors. So we were left with the question of how do we go about doing that? So over the past few years, that's what we've been working on as well, is figuring out how we can actually teach coaches and improve the quality of their leadership behaviors. So we've been developing a workshop that actually is focused on helping coaches understand these behaviors and how they can, again, improve the quantity and quality of their leadership behaviors in their interactions with their athletes. So that's a little bit of the background, and we look forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Muted. Excellent. Thank you very much, Jean and Jennifer, for that fascinating insight into transformational leadership and transformational coaching. I guess now we have an opportunity to discuss between the 3 of us some of the things that have come up in the slides. And then those of you that are watching the webinar today, please pop your questions in either the comments box or in the chat on Zoom as we go along. I'd like to just start with this idea of the leadership model, if I may. Often we get a lot of young coaches who seem to attach value to a laissez-faire approach because it seems like the most relaxed, the most cool approach to coaching, as if to say I'm quite chilled. I wonder what you feel are the risks to this approach to leadership in comparison to a transformational approach.
Well, I think that a key thing to think about in terms of for laissez-faire, that really it's focused on coaches who are actively disengaging from their athletes. So this really would refer to you're abdicating your responsibilities as a coach. You're not fulfilling your role as a coach. So this might be, not really having a practice plan, not being organized. If there's a conflict on your team, you're ignoring it. But it really refers to active disengagement. So I just want to make sure that in terms of laissez-faire that, if you're making a deliberate choice to let them learn from themselves or something, that's really not what laissez-faire is. Laissez-faire really refers more to the active disengagement. And I think a lot of the issues around laissez-faire is this idea of passive leadership is linked with a lot of negative outcomes. So it can be linked with perceptions of ambiguity or lack of clarity for athletes. So they're not really sure what they're supposed to be doing or what expectations they're supposed to be meeting. So that can lead to feelings of stress and anxiety. And I think the other issue is, sometimes there's this perception that if we do nothing, then we can't have any negative impact. But that's really not what the research shows. Doing nothing is truly a behavior, and that it can lead to negative outcomes. So I think that's often when people tend to use it, it often comes down to either I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, or I don't care and I don't want to be doing this, but often it's I don't know. So I think that's where the importance of helping coaches have a better understanding of and giving them the tools and the skills to be able to use more effective behaviors, it becomes really important.
Thank you for that.
I think to me, Gary, just one little thing. I think the potential that sport can have for personal development is very big in terms of, and I don't think we use all the potential that sport can have. So I think, less if I could have some negative, or it could be, it could be neutral, but I think we really need to think about sport as an activity that can really help people develop above and beyond, and so I think we need to think about ways of doing this, and through these kinds of leadership style that would allow coaches to be able to help people develop as individuals.
And I guess there's an emphasis there as young people as much as it is as young athletes, which kind of really resonates with me personally. I guess in that instance, then, in terms of developing relationships with people before athlete, I guess what is the role of the development of trust in the creation of a transformational leadership approach? And just how difficult is it to develop that trust with young athletes across different ages?
I think it's a really good question in terms of when we looked at the research on transformational leadership across different contexts. One of the things that we were interested in is understanding that black box between a leader does something, and then we have all these wonderful outcomes that we knew are associated, but what's in that black box? And those are really the processes. And one of the key processes that came out of that literature review was this idea of trust. That trust is one of those key processes that link transformational leadership with positive development. And when we spoke to coaches and athletes about how they actually go about building trust, so what are those things that coaches do that facilitate that perception of trust? Some of the key things that came out of that were around their values. So they know what their coaches value, and they can tell what they value from their behaviors. A lot of it also came down to consistency. So there's a consistency between what they say they value and how they actually behave. And also there's consistency in how they treat athletes. So it's not that they behave one way that there is some consistency in their behavior, which we found really interesting because in our previous work, we found that really effective coaches tended to have really consistent patterns of behavior. So there is some structure and we can measure that consistency. And the other one came down to the idea of showing vulnerability. So recognizing that in order to build trust, there was a wonderful definition I found in literature that talked about trust as shared vulnerability. So when I tell you something about myself, you're much more likely to tell me something about yourself. So it really is about sharing that vulnerability. And that's where things like, telling people stories about, your experiences as an athlete or in your life and how that really builds that sense of trust in that relationship. But also that, it's okay that you're a human and that you'll make mistakes. So if we want our athletes to feel comfortable to be able to make mistakes and try new things, how can we actually model those ourselves? So again, it's really about sort of a consistency between what you expect of your athletes and how you would like them to behave and how we expect ourselves to behave.
Just one thing I want to add to this. I think this is a very, like what we presented and what Jen has developed in terms of observation instrument is very unique in the leadership literature, because, everything that she said there, we're able to observe that. I think in the past, it's always been perceptions, and it's always asking athletes or asking people how they perceive their leader. And I think in those perceptions, we have a very difficult time to find those more intricate types of behaviors that makes a difference. And I think being able to observe and being able to code those behaviors has been really something that really helped us to develop that workshop and to develop really a behavioral component to what transformational leadership looks like.
I guess as well, that as well from a research perspective, other people, other stakeholders within kind of small or big sporting organizations can observe those things happening too. And I really valued the term, Jennifer, that you used in terms of shared vulnerability between perhaps me, the coach, and the athlete. I wonder how you feel about having the parents or the guardians having that shared vulnerability too, because perhaps their perception of coach or coaching and maybe that of the all-knowing individual who engages in transactional knowledge versus those that are willing to share mistakes, humility, and behaviors in that way.
I mean, in terms of, I think what's really interesting about a lot of this research too is that it comes down to relationships, and that any relationship is dynamic and reciprocal between parties. So it really, any of these behaviors that we're talking about, it is important that there really aren't a one-way street, that it really involves sort of a back and forth between the coaches and the athletes, or between a coach and a parent, or between a parent and a child. If people are interested, there actually is some really neat research looking at parenting through a transformational leadership lens. So actually understanding links between parenting styles and that literature, and the links between transformational leadership. Because I think as a parent myself, nothing puts you to the test of showing vulnerability more so than being a parent, because you're going to make mistakes and you're not going to have all the answers. And I think that again goes in terms of, like you said, that relationship between the parents and the coaches too. So I think, hopefully this actually gives parents and coaches a common language to talk about the coaching process. So when you see a coach who is, that's a great question, I'm not sure, why don't we look up the answer together? That's showing vulnerability and humility, and that's teaching the athlete how we can actually find information and how we can go about addressing those gaps. So that parents, if they see something like that, that's really what the coach is trying to do. So I think that's part of this idea, is sort of breaking down some of the mystery and demystifying leadership to give parents and stakeholders a language to talk about leadership in sport.
Jean, anything to add there?
No, not too much. I think I enjoy listening to Jen. No, I think just as an anecdote, when we do the workshop with coaches, very often, many coaches will have kids and will have parents, and they will translate that information. They will really, it will really resonate to them as parents. And so this kind of things could be applied in any kind of relationships. And it could be with your kids, or it could be with your, at work, or with your spouse, or with others, with your partners. And so it's an interesting way to look at it, because it's not necessarily specific to coaching, but it's like Jen said, it's all kinds of relationship, applies to all kinds of relationships.
I guess it also links back to the coach understanding why they're doing what they're doing. So earlier when you alluded, Jen, to this idea that laissez-faire, are they laissez-faire because they're being deliberately laissez-faire, or is it because they don't know what their particular pedagogical approach is, how they want to lead a group, what kind of approaches to teaching and learning they have. So it's about really understanding why I'm doing what I'm doing and making coaching behavior deliberate.
Yeah, so I think that's where you're seeing a link between what Jean had said earlier about the coaching effectiveness and linking the intrapersonal with the interpersonal. So very much that if you want to use more effective interpersonal behaviors, that you really need to know yourself, and that interpersonal knowledge becomes really important. So spending time reflecting on your interpersonal behaviors, knowing what you value, and what you want to achieve out of sport is really important, and understanding what interpersonal behaviors you'll use to get to those outcomes. I think one of the challenges we have is often when we ask coaches to reflect on their behaviors and to reflect on their coaching, we're often focusing on the professional knowledge. So we're reflecting on, what are my practice designs, and what activities am I using, and how could I make the structure of my practices better? But actually dedicating time and space to reflecting just on the interpersonal, but also giving them a language and a framework to actually think about those behaviors a little bit differently. That's where knowing yourself becomes really important, and very much, often in the workshop, we'll take some time and ask coaches to think about what their approach is to coaching, and what those philosophies are, because again, that's what you're trying to actually put into practice. So hopefully there's a lot of links between coaches who are interested in, I would like to, build a coaching philosophy. Transformational leadership might give you some tools and behaviors to use to actually put that philosophy into practice.
Just a quick note on the intrapersonal. I think this is where the observation instrument also become very, very important, because coaches can see themselves and they can get some kind of a profile of their leadership style. And sometimes you think, I think, Jen, you can talk a little bit more about those studies, but, intellectual stimulation, when we interview coaches about intellectual stimulation, they say, oh, I do that all the time. And, I ask questions and I get my athletes involved, and then you observe them and they don't do it, So I think putting the video and we did some simulated recall studies where we have coaches looking at themselves and then analyzing their behaviors. But it's a very good learning tool. It's a very informative tool to help you reflect about your own behaviors, and because sometimes we are not always aware of what we do and how we interact with people. So that's that's another component of the intrapersonal.
I just wanted to share a quick story. We actually had a really wonderful opportunity to go on. We had doing work with coaches and actually go out onto the field with them and observe their behaviors during a coaching course. And there was a coach who, they had athletes on the field and they were running a drill, and he stopped one of the athletes after she had done something, a really great play, and he stopped her and he goes, that was great. What were you thinking? Can you tell everyone else, what you were paying attention to? And he really used that learning moment as a great opportunity for her to share what she was doing, but also to help the other athletes understand her thought process and what she was paying attention to. And you could just see the smile on this girl's face for the rest of the day, and everyone had congratulated her on this piece. And when we were talking to the coach afterwards, that was part of the idea, was that example was a way of recognizing, athletes' accomplishments and using individualized consideration, but also intellectual stimulation. We're getting them to actually describe what they were doing. And I thought that was such a cool moment where he got to reflect on that he had used those behaviors in reaction to something well done versus using those behaviors in reaction to a mistake. So often we'll see people use intellectual stimulation when we make an error. So something's gone wrong, can you tell me about it? Can we fix it? But actually using those behaviors after something's gone really, really well. And that was the sort of light bulb moment for him, was that he was actually using the behaviors, but when he was deciding to use those behaviors, made just as big of a difference.
I guess it's really powerful, isn't it, to start to think about we can intervene when things go well as when things go wrong, and the positive difference that can have on the response of a young person. I guess that leads me to a question around this idea of intellectual stimulation and kind of putting some more ownership on the athletes. I guess from your observation, guys, do you see that to be something that can only be done with older athletes, or do you see it happening with younger players, younger participants across sport?
Yeah,
sure. I mean, I think the nice thing is that these behaviors can be used at any age. They just might look a little bit different. So I have a 6-year-old now, but so I've spent a lot of time with children, but also watching children's shows. And if you watch children's programming, or you'll notice that they use intellectual stimulation all the time, because they'll ask for things, which comes next in the pattern, red or blue? Well, that's intellectual stimulation. You're getting the kids to provide that answer. Parents do it all the time. What would you rather for a snack? Apples or grapes? You're happy with either answer, but it's giving them some autonomy and then some choice. Versus if you have, older athletes, you might be able to get away with a more open-ended one. What would you like to work on today? Versus you might have to tailor it when you're working with underages in terms of, would you like to do this activity or this activity? So I think it's one of those, again, those nice things where these behaviors work at all ages, but you might just need to tailor them in some of those ways to others. And I think the other piece of intellectual stimulation is knowing that your athletes are wonderful resources. They have wonderful ideas. They're creative, and they see things from a different perspective, and that each of their unique stories really lends its own ideas of what sport can be. So I would really encourage coaches that if you're interested in learning, talk to your athletes. You'll find out so much information in terms of what they can bring to the table, and I think that can and in every example of coaches we've had who embrace intellectual stimulation, I think that's always the best part, is you learn so much from them.
Just a quick note. To me, it's the beauty of what we have here in terms of we're providing a framework for people to discuss interpersonal skill and discuss. So now we're providing a little bit more of a more precise, intellectual stimulation. What does it look like for a 6-year-old? What does it look like for a 20-year-old? So the last thing I think that we want to do in coaching, and I think it happens a lot, is to be prescriptive and to tell people this is what you have to do. So what we have is we're providing that framework, and when we go to the workshop, or when coaches go to those frameworks, they say, okay, what does it look like in my culture, in my sport, with my kids at this age, maybe with girls, maybe that's different, or it looks different. And it certainly probably looks different in soccer in England than it does in hockey in Canada, or so I think that's, I think the last thing we want to do is prescribe and say this, you have to say these things, or you have to do these things. So we're giving the framework, and it's really exciting when we do a workshop, because the coaches are really coming up with we're not giving them the ideas, and they're really giving us those behaviors, and that becomes like a sharing, and we're just there to kind of stimulate the discussion. But really they're learning from each other, and they're realizing, I think coaches are realizing that most of the time they will do these things, but now they say, oh, I'm doing this all the time, I'll keep doing it, because it seems that it's supported by some research or some literature that would say that it's a good thing. So I think that's, I think to me, having that framework is very helpful to discuss and to talk about interpersonal behaviors.
Yeah, I also just wanted to, Jean's made me think of a lot of the work that we had done with coaches of athletes with disabilities, and particularly in recognizing the value of intellectual stimulation, in that the idea was that often coaches, one of the concerns was, well, I'm not an expert in their disability, but the athlete is, and they're an expert in what works for them and what doesn't. So we actually saw when we talked to athletes with disabilities, a real desire for their coaches to use intellectual stimulation to get me involved. I can help. And that we'd actually done a workshop that we had tailored specifically for coaches with athletes with disabilities. And the conversations we had around intellectual stimulation were amazing in terms of different ways that they had been able to do it. So for instance, we were looking at in a skiing context where one of the, how they could figure out how to have direction with their athletes. And they weren't able to verbally communicate with left and right, but they had actually adapted with having one crunchy mitt and one soft mitt. And that had figured that solution together. And again, really working with the athletes and hearing their point of view of how they could make this, technique or the sport work for them and their abilities. So again, I think it's just a nice illustration of this is what good coaching looks like across different contexts, but the specific examples that you use will be tailored to your own experience.
I guess then there's two things there, isn't there? There's number one, which is the athlete is a really rich resource of information and insight. And then there's also this emphasis on the coach really understanding their own context enough to shape their behaviors so they fit. I guess that leads nicely then to some of the questions from the audience. So we, again, keep them coming in, guys, whether that be on YouTube or via Zoom. The first question is from Aaron, and he's asked, what differences, if any, has research shown on leadership styles when compared to coaching experience?
Sorry, just to clarify, is that in terms of with more novice coaches versus more experienced?
I think that's what Aaron's getting at there. In terms of, is there a particular style that's associated? Yes, he's saying yes in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So I think it's one of those interesting things. So that's one of the goals that we're trying to do right now is to do more studies and to get more videos, so we can sort of tease out some of those differences. I think one of those things around anecdotally, it really depends a little bit more on the coach in terms of their own values of coaching rather than necessarily their experience level. I think because you can see a mix, because you can see really experienced coaches who use these behaviors a lot. But we've also seen experienced coaches where, that the coaching culture has changed over time. So I think one of, intellectual stimulation is actually a good example where, we have seen some novice coaches who are a bit hesitant to use the intellectual stimulation because it inherently involves giving up a bit of control of your practice, that you're handing over control to the athlete. So we have seen some where that, there's a bit of hesitancy there to use the behaviors. But on the flip side, we've also seen novice coaches who fully embrace intellectual stimulation and can run with it. So, to answer your question, I think we would love to have more data to be able to answer that more concretely. And sorry, I'm just saying Aaron's things that, yes, I think self-awareness is really important. So at any level, if you're novice or, you've been coaching for 30, 40 years, if you understand who you are as a coach and what you're comfortable with and what your values are, that these behaviors can work for you in your context. So that's a great question. And hopefully we'll get back to you with more data hopefully soon.
Yeah, and I would add to this that experience too in other areas of life could contribute to this also. Like we've had coaches that never heard about transformational leadership, but they're very transformational. They never heard the term, or they never, but they use intellectual stimulation, individualized consideration. They use all those. But I think it's just a background in terms of where, how they develop those relationships with other people. They're just more, they've had experiences that allow them to do that. And I think it really, to me, it's like very often people will talk about soft skill, or will talk about these soft skill that coaches have, or that's a good coach because he's got great, or she has great soft skills. And then, it kind of bother us a bit talking about that way, to talk about interpersonal behaviors and interpersonal skills, because sure, there's some people that may have it more than others. There's some people that kind of, through their life experience, they're more transformational than others. But it doesn't mean that if you're not, you cannot learn it and you cannot become better at it. And that's the whole point here, is that this is not, it's not softer than any other skill. It's a skill that you can work on and that you can improve. And it's not like you were not born a transformational leader. You can develop those skills, and you develop them. And if you start here, you can go there. And some people start at different places. But yeah, that's I think that's an important point in terms of coaching experience.
I guess that goes back to this idea of being self-aware of those as skills in your own coach's toolbox, and then recognizing as and when those need to kind of develop and strengthen, and taking those opportunities to do that. I'm just going to go to Ellie on YouTube, who has asked, does transformational leadership look different on a match day versus training? And have you observed differences in coaches in their behavior across those two different settings?
Jen?
So we actually we did have a study where we were looking at specifically differences. We were observing coaches both in practice and in competitions. I think what an interesting piece is, again, we're continuing to build that database of data on looking at differences in competition and practice. But I think those behaviors still come up in both contexts. So, but again, sort of the amount of time that you spend on it, or might change based on whether it's a practice or if it's a game. I mean, certainly if anyone's a fan of the NBA, we've seen really famous examples of people using transformational coaching behaviors in game situations. Phil Jackson was very famous for timeouts where he wouldn't say anything and he'd get the players to talk amongst themselves. We've seen Steve Kerr use it quite a bit, where you can use these behaviors on game day. But we've also seen, so I think it's more about how you balance it. And it might look a little bit different, but that they are applicable both in competition in the game. I mean, another one that you'll often see on game days, lots of discussions around it, sort of both inspirational motivation. So having discussions about what your goals are, what you're going to achieve that day. You'll see lots of symbols and stories of what your team vision. You might see, active engagement in your team cheers or discussions around who you are as a team and how we're going to behave on game day. And those individualized consideration as far as, recognizing when something's going really well and giving feedback. I think those are, again, the idea is that you can use these behaviors, but again, sort of how you balance them might look a little bit different between practice and competition.
I think the one we tend to see, or that coaches can demonstrate very well during games, is idealized influence, and and very behaviors, very common behaviors, like yelling at the referee, yelling at the opponents, and so those are, what are the values of the coach. And we know that with young kids, if you tell your kids to do something, don't yell at the referee, but you do it yourself, then we know that the kids will see that and they will model these types of behaviors. So I think that's one that I think that always comes up in during games or during competition.
So thank you for that. Again, I think often, I know I certainly catch myself on game day sometimes behaving slightly differently. And I guess the art is learning how to catch yourself and go back to those kind of clear values and beliefs that you develop about the way that you interact with your athletes. But it's a challenge for us all, right, in those moments when the first whistle goes and when the final whistle goes. I'm going to go to Philip, who has asked on the Zoom chat, to what degree did the idea of practice what you preach have an effect on leadership?
I think it's one of those pieces where I think, as far as the data we have, yet we haven't been able to sort of see specifically the effects of each dimension on outcomes, because we tend to sort of look at it more as a whole. But certainly when we talk about people's perceptions of what their best coach, that aspects of idealized influence come up every single time. And I think one of the things that we're really interested in looking at more is the idea of idealized influence and values, and really tying it to that research. I also would say that we have data showing, again, measuring the consistency of coaching behaviors, and that more effective coaches in terms of personal development have more consistent and structured behavioral patterns. So again, that's some data we can look to understand that it does have a positive influence on athlete development. And I think these are some things that right now we're actually doing some research looking particularly at vulnerability, but actually in a coaching and medicine context. So understanding how we coach residents who are learning how to be doctors. What does that look like in a medical education context? So, but really focusing in on that idea of vulnerability and how that could be really important for learning and development.
And I'm sure Jen can talk more about this than I do, but I think that's what makes transformational leadership very appealing is this idealized influence component, which is the value system that people have. So there's a lot of theories of leadership that don't have that they will just tell, like Hitler was a good leader because there was a lot of people following him, but the value were wrong. And the value were, so, we can say that, well, we won't get into politics now, but there's leaders of the world that are different sets of value. But I think that's the nice thing about, you can have leadership and followers without having those values that we know are ethical and are good for the people that you're working with. And I think that's a big difference between other theories of leadership.
Yeah, so, and if anyone's interested, there is a really interesting body of literature around pseudo-transformational, so people who seem like they're acting transformational, but if you're missing that values component, or if it's not genuine, how that relates to that idea of pseudo-transformational. But I think that, again, that idea is that value piece represents a really integral component of what transformational leadership is all about.
And I guess for those coaches out there that might be now thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure I know what my values are, I haven't had the opportunity to get those down on paper, it's probably worthwhile going to your club and asking if they have a particular set of values which they go by, and building from there to see how you fit in the whole coaching system. Those are some really useful tools to kind of stimulate that kind of thought and build from. I'm moving to Kirsty now, who has asked, you're using the term intellectual stimulation. If we think about autonomy or athletes learning to take responsibility, is there any difference, or are we talking about the same thing?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I think what you're very astutely recognizing that there's a lot of overlap between aspects of transformational leadership and other theories that we use for understanding coaching. So in particular, autonomy supportive coaching, people may also be familiar with empowering coaching, and other theories that are centered on self-determination theory and achievement goal theory. There is a lot of overlap, and that very much we drew upon those theories when we were developing our behavioral categories, because we know they're important. So as much as we were formed directly from leadership literature, as I said before, previously, we had also reviewed coaching literature to understand what we knew were important coaching behaviors. So that body of literature that had focused on the importance of autonomy supportive, but you see a lot of overlap between those dimensions. So recognizing that transformational leadership is not the only one that talks about these really important concepts. It was just one way for us to conceptualize it. So we decided to go a leadership route, but certainly others have used, like I said, autonomy supportive and or authentic leadership or other lenses on this, which talk a lot about this similar concepts. So very much want to recognize that there's a lot of overlap between other theories as well.
I think one strength of transformational leadership is the literature that's supporting the concept, and the literature that has been done in other areas too. So that was brought into coaching and it's been used in coaching, but like the military, the education, literature, medicine, and so lots of research backing up some of the things that we talked about, and at the same time very applicable to the 4I in terms of how we can conceptualize those types of behaviors.
And I guess it's about coaches working out the right balance and blend of tools that they use as well, in order to kind of emit those values, those ideas, a transformational coaching approach. And it's find out what's right for you in your context and why. So that obviously includes a balance and blend of some of those ideas, whether they're called one of the 4Is, or whether they're called the achievement goal theory, or whether they're called autonomy supportive. I wonder, are there any kind of other resources that you would recommend that coaches draw upon in order to kind of really make sense of their own coaching behavior in a transformational way?
I think there's there certainly are tools that are out there to learn about. There are some measurement tools that exist, some questionnaires that you could certainly use to self-reflect on your behaviors. We've been working on some of those tools ourselves. There's some wonderful books on leadership, as well as articles that do exist, but there, like I said, there are some more popular books as well on transformational leadership, particularly from the organizational psych literature that really help you reflect. There's also learning from other coaches, I think, is a really important way to learn about these behaviors. So having discussions with your colleagues and your peers about interpersonal relationships. So just learning from each other, what do you do to inspire your athletes? What do you do to show your athletes that you care about them? Having these conversations with other coaches, I think, is so important, because what we've found by working with coaches is they have so many wonderful stories of how they do it, and that really by whether that's with a friend over coffee or Zoom coffee, and if you might have to do nowadays, or through communities of practice, spending time talking about these behaviors and how people use them, I think will really give you a lot of time to reflect on these behaviors yourselves. But that's, I think, another nice thing is that when you, I'll give everyone a warning now that if you start to look for these behaviors, once you start to see them, it's really hard to unsee them. And you'll see coaches using them on TV. You'll see them using them in real life. You'll see people using these behaviors at the grocery store, in your doctor's office, that these really are human behaviors. So I think that's sort of keeping that awareness piece and keeping your eyes open to find these behaviors in unexpected places, because that's where you'll learn more about them. But they're like I said, if anyone's interested, I'm happy to provide a list of some suggested readings and places where you can learn a bit more about it.
Great, thank you for that. We have no more questions from the audience, so I guess this is an opportunity to say thank you so much, Jean and Jennifer, for your amazing contributions today. For those of you viewing, this will be able to view again on YouTube in a couple of hours. For those that have got so much kind of notes to take, but just kind of enjoying all of the knowledge as it's coming from our speakers. Thank you all for tuning in on Zoom and via YouTube, and we hope to see you in the next iCoachKids shares. Please keep an eye on our social media channels, whether that be via Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or even our website for future news. And stay safe and stay connected.